Welcome to the Citizens Reporter. I'm the host and editor, Diana Longry. Thank you for tuning in. The Citizens Reporter is a weekly news cablecast brought to you from the Valley Access Studios out of Stillwater. Now, to help me this week with our news is one of our regular citizen reporters, Mr. Mark Bradley. Thank you, Mr. Bradley, for being here.
Thank you for having me. And we're going to try to rush through some of the things that we've had that have come up in the last couple of weeks. But the first one I want to talk about is in the business section of the Minneapolis Tribune on Sunday. They were talking about all eyes are on the capital's riverfront. And of course, it is our capital, and it is an exciting area to look at. But the biggest problem we have is that we've got a big open eyesore in the middle where there's no buildings there. And what they're saying is, well, we've got some plans for new buildings going in. I've got a problem with that. How can you have a design for a building if you don't know who your client is?
Right. And Mr. Bradley, this is a good point in that certainly if you have a shell of a building that can be retrofitted for whoever that future business or occupant is going to be, well, that's well and good. But if their plan is to develop a building that's completely constructed and renovated and put in place, well then, depending upon who the occupant is, you may find then you've got now new costs of retrofitting it to meet their needs.
Perfect example of that would be taking a look at the original Ramsey County St. Paul correctional facility that was in that site already. And they could not find anybody who wanted to take the building after they decided to move the incarcerated criminals out of that building. So that's why they had to tear it all down in the first place. And it's been that type of eyesore for a long time, and it seems like they're looking at building another eyesore to me.
Well, certainly it would make sense that if you knew in advance what type of a business or occupant that you were wooing to come to that location, then you could build your plans around that. But I don't know that we've actually heard of any particular business or occupant that is actually what they would say a hot lead to occupy that location. And maybe that's what they need to do, is actually find the occupant first and not think, well, if we put a building there, then they will come.
Right, and that's the sad part about it. The only one I heard that's even interested in that area right now is the Milwaukee and Sioux, that I believe have the two hotels that are already in St. Paul. And they kind of threw that out before, so I don't know where they're looking at right now. But it'd be nice to have an answer from St. Paul that isn't so, how should I say, disjointed.
Then, well, what's next, Mr. Bradley?
Okay, then we have what's talking about, we've been talking about the pipeline forever, and a lot of people know my feelings on it. That I was never supportive of the pipeline. I'm not supportive of it now. But I also have to point out that what's bothering me even more right now is they haven't even completed the pipeline that they're supposed to be doing as a connection up, and they're now looking at raising the capacity of it. If you've designed a pipeline and the equipment was designed for a certain pressure, I don't understand how you can then come out and say, well, now let's raise that pressure to an abnormally higher level. And the biggest issue is it's going under that St. Louis River. And if you're going to have a break there, it's better to have it at a lower pressure than a higher pressure. And this is something that's being done by, of course, the North Dakota Republican State Assembly. All the equipment wasn't designed for this higher pressure.
Well, and I would certainly think that when the pipeline was initially put in and installed, that there were certain specifications as to the load that it could handle, and as you indicated, the pressure and the volume, and all of that was calculated in. Well, what's next there, Mr. Bradley?
Well, what we have next is something that was an opinion by Joe Souchere talking about the light rail continues to be a disaster. And he's pointing out the fact that what's happening right now is they are not getting the revenues they expected to get because a lot of people are basically avoiding paying their fair share on getting on and using the facilities incorrectly once they're on these light rail trains.
And you know, talking about the funding for the light rail and how much revenue they're going to generate, you're right. There are a lot of fare skippers.
Right.
And yet, do these folks who are fare skippers, do they know that they're, in some cases, I know particularly for the bus, that if you fall within a certain income level, you actually can qualify for a dollar fare. And then the rest of it, of course, is supplemented by, you know, the rest of us.
Right.
But at least it's budgeted for so that when they put together their annual budgets, they know that in the budget there's a line item for the discount tickets, and then there's the regular tickets, and then there's the big supplement from the public coffers. And at least then they can budget for it. But
Right.
when you've got fare skippers and they don't actually pay anything, not even the reduced fare, well, that's not necessarily in the budget, although they probably should have had it somewhat in the budget to know that there were going to be fare skippers and that would have been a shortfall. And do they have that calculated in their budget? Now, let's take a look at that article, Mr.
Sure.
Bradley, and that it was fascinating in this opinion, the way that it was put, because a lot of us have heard about how the crime spikes are increasing on the light rail
Right.
and on the bus routes as well. And that's some of the big concern that Maplewood and White Bear Lake residents have with regard to the rush line and the BRT, is that when that comes through Maplewood and White Bear Lake, that indeed then that crime spree will come to our communities. But in this particular piece by Joe Shushree, he says that two train operators told legislators last week that they often fear for their safety and that it is not at all uncommon to board a train and find it that it has recently been used as a restroom, which of course means that you've got a puddle somewhere on the floor that is not from the rain or the snow. Okay.
And you have to clean it up for the other passengers.
That's right, you do indeed. And then they went on to say that they also find bloody needles and half-naked people. Assaults and fights, yes, there's assaults and fights as well. Reports of serious crime, assault and robbery have risen more than 20% on trains and buses since 2015. The Metro Transit reported 125 aggravated assaults through October 2019, compared with 50 reports in 2015. Now, here's where they come up with a solution. Now, is this going to be a solution? I don't know, but at least I want to tell you that they've also talked about this solution at the Metropolitan Council as well. But this article goes on to say that fortunately, there is a solution. The DFL-controlled House is expected to debate a bill that would call for the hiring of a new force of superheroes, the transit ambassadors. Mayor Melvin Carter wants to put ambassadors on the streets of St. Paul to stop crime, but, and this is Joe Shushree says, I don't believe they are out on patrol just yet. So the transit ambassadors, it goes on to say, that they will write citations for fare skipping and otherwise keep a nice, tidy train and putting everybody's peace of mind in place.
I also want to know, are we going to supply each of these individuals, these superheroes, with masks and capes as well? Then we can recognize, hey, there's a superhero. All right.
How effective will this be? What kind of enforcement opportunities?
And how long does it exist along it?
Right, and at the Metropolitan Council, this was discussed. Our representative, Sue Vento, on the Metropolitan Council, she was not particularly pleased with the title of ambassadors. She felt that that made it seem more like they were less like enforcement authorities, and more like the welcome wagon and the neighbor down the street who comes to your home with a basket to welcome you to the neighborhood. So whether or not ambassador is the right word or not, well, that certainly is being debated. The effectiveness that this program might have is also debated, and whether or not, as Mr. Bradley indicated, what are the costs of this program and how is that going to be measured against the effectiveness of how the statistics change for the crime levels. Thank you, Mr. Bradley, for bringing that to our attention.
Right.
And I direct our viewers that if you'd like to watch more of the Metropolitan Council, they do have their meetings online on the internet. What's next, Mr. Bradley?
Well, then, of course, since we've been talking about transit, and this has been an issue for a while, and we keep being told that we're not going to use cars anymore, and the goal line is having lost its rating to the point that it may not be able to be constructed. It's been put on the low level of priorities as far as our national program for constructing transit possibilities within the state.
Right, and certainly that the issue of funding is always going to be an issue, I think, in Minnesota, because there are certain criteria in order to get funding. You have to have the density, you have to have the need, and certainly they look at whether or not the project is shovel ready or not. And so we've got so many of these projects where the elected officials are scurrying so frantically to try to make their projects shovel ready, but in essence, they may not meet other criteria. Now, in this particular case with the Gold Line, one of the things holding up the Gold Line is the fact that part of the plan doesn't include enough parking at the easternmost terminus of the route. Now, when we were out to Richmond, Virginia on our reporting trip, when the Ramsey County Rail Authority and the Rush Line Advisory Committees went out there on their little junket to see the BRT operating in Richmond, Virginia, we had an opportunity of talking with one of the project managers out there. We talked to him actually for an hour. And one of the key points he brought up to us during the interview we had with him is that it is critical that for BRT routes, bus rapid transit routes, that the parking facilities that you have for your riders are to be on the ends or the terminus of the route, that you don't fill up the middle of the route or along the route with the parking facilities or the park and rides, that those are best placed on the terminus. And that
Right.
is actually what then is holding up the Gold Line, is that they don't have the parking that would be considered best practices out on the eastern portion end of that terminus of the Gold Line. And we have been talking about that issue with regard to the Rush Line on these programs for the last few months, as the Rush Line advisory committees are talking about where they're going to be putting their parking facilities along the route of the Rush Line rather than addressing how they're going to have parking at the terminus. So my prediction is, Mr. Bradley, based upon what's happened with the Gold Line, that this very same issue is going to rear its ugly head when it comes to the Rush Line, and the Rush Line thinks that they're going to be in line for federal funding. Then it will come out that, oh, you don't have the appropriate amount of parking on the terminuses of the ends of the Rush Line. So that would mean, White Bear Lake, that since you are the northernmost terminus of the Rush Line at this point, that means that you're going to have some big park and ride in the middle of your town, which is exactly what everybody in White Bear Lake has been fighting. They don't want to lose their businesses in the middle of town of White Bear Lake. And of course, what about the southernmost terminus of the Rush Line in St. Paul? Well, of course, it's, maybe that's not going to be the issue, but certainly I think on the northern end, it will be an issue. So thank you, Mr.
Right.
Bradley, for bringing that point up about the gold line, because I think we're going to see the very same arguments transfer over to the rush line.
Right, but you also have to realize that I think that argument will be part of St. Paul, because that is also where the light rail is supposed to be stopping in the general area. And there isn't enough parking there unless they start constructing in the old Union Depot area to raise about a 5 to 7 to 10-story parking ramp in there for both the light rail and for the rapid transit riding. So that touches on what we had for that. And then we go and we had something that's going on moving from Maplewood to Maplewood again, where there's now an argument over fire service.
We have seen time and time again where, municipalities, they get together, they decide to enter into joint power agreements where they're going to cooperate and work with each other, and then one of them decides that that agreement isn't working out quite so well for them, and they're going to ditch the rest of their partners, so to speak, in that joint powers agreement and go out on their own. Well, we saw that, Mr. Bradley, certainly a couple of years ago when Maplewood decided to leave the Ramsey County Suburban Cable Commission,
Right.
and left all their partners in the lurch and basically shut down public access for all the communities of White Bear Lake, White Bear Township, North St. Paul, Oakdale, Vadnais Heights, and some other smaller communities, that little Lake Elmo, City of Grant, Willerny, Birchwood. All of their partners were left in the lurch when Maplewood decided to leave that joint powers agreement they had been in for 25 years. Now, all of those communities, they felt abandoned by Maplewood. Well, now the shoe is on the other foot. Now Maplewood feels abandoned because they are a partner, a member of a mutual aid or a type of joint powers agreement with the city of St. Paul and Roseville and a couple of other communities for providing mutual aid in the event of fire calls or emergency medical calls like heart attacks. And in this agreement, it says that if the city where the call is originating from, for some reason that they're engaged at another call somewhere else within their community, that one of their neighboring communities will come to the rescue of that city, and that they will send their fire trucks or their paramedics to that call and service it until then the city where the call is at can get to the call and that they can take over. Well, apparently, the city of St. Paul feels that they have been doing too much of doing the calls in other communities, including Maplewood. And so they want to focus on just providing calls and service to calls in the city of St. Paul, and that they want to withdraw from this agreement. Well, what's so fascinating is that the mayor of Maplewood, appointed Mayor Marley Abrams, in her response to this this potential for pullout from the agreement by St. Paul, she says, "We felt abandoned by our partner with no real warning or ability to find a workable remedy for their concerns." Well, she is the one who orchestrated Maplewood's pulling out of the Ramsey Washington Suburban Cable Commission and abandoned all of those communities in that partnership. Now she feels abandoned herself.
Right.
Imagine that. Wow. What does it feel like, I wonder?
Well, also the other thing that people should be aware of is that Maplewood at one time had 5 separate stations.
Yes.
And we used to have full response by volunteer firemen from
right.
all 5 stations.
Right.
And we've gone down to now what's supposed to be 3 stations, but we really don't use the 3rd station, which is Hazelwood. And now they want to rebuild Hazelwood at some point. But at the same time, I believe there's some type of statement that the city council said that they only want to go down to 2 stations.
Yes, that's exactly right. And this is a story that we covered. Back in October 2019 here on these news reports. And in this particular article that you can find in the Star Tribune dated February 19th, it talks about the potential for St. Paul looking to pull out of this mutual aid agreement. And there is a little chart there that does show, with regard to the various communities, St. Paul, Maplewood, Roseville, and some of the other smaller communities, including North St. Paul, it does indicate how many times did they give mutual aid to a community outside of their boundaries, and how many times did they receive aid from one of their neighboring communities. And so with regard to looking at Maplewood and St. Paul, they're the ones that have the highest numbers in either category. And it does indicate, though, that Maplewood, of all the communities in this mutual aid agreement, that Maplewood is the community that has provided the most number of calls and to service to the most number of calls outside of Maplewood boundaries. And so for the period of time of October 2016 to January 4th, 2020, Maplewood provided service 45 times to other communities outside of Maplewood. Now, this does not break it down as to whether or not that's in St. Paul or Roseville or North St. Paul. That it doesn't say. But it does indicate that during that same time period that Maplewood received 30 calls, service on 30 calls from communities outside of Maplewood. But there again, it doesn't necessarily say that it's all from that it's all come from St. Paul. So it's a fascinating little chart. And what St. Paul is alleging is that they're not just focusing on Maplewood, they're actually focusing on all of their co-members of this agreement, because they are saying, in essence, that St. Paul bears a disproportionate burden for the suburbs. So that means that St. Paul, when they're giving service to other communities, it has to be one of their suburban co-members. And so that would be Maplewood, White Bear Lake, North St. Paul, Lake Johanna, Roseville, Little Canada, Falcon Heights, and New Brighton. So in that time period, St. Paul provided service to 33 calls outside of their boundaries. So that's only an average of 11 calls a year as an average. Maplewood provided 45 calls outside of its boundary in that same time period. So actually, Maplewood has provided more mutual aid than St. Paul has provided to all the suburbs. So, it makes you wonder whether or not, if St. Paul really has been the disproportionate burden or not. Now, we did dig into our archives to look back at when the Maplewood Fire Department and paramedic department gave a presentation to the Maplewood City Council about this issue of limiting the number of fire stations in Maplewood and limiting that down to 2. And so we thought this would be a good time to jump off from this, because if indeed there is going to be this breakdown of this mutual aid agreement, is having 2 fire stations going to be sufficient for the coverage For Maplewood, I don't know.
And why abandon their second newest station?
Yes, which is in the Gladstone neighborhood.
Right. Since it really had no problems, according to them, if you listen to this, that we're going to be watching. But my point there is, if they're going to be going down to it, does that mean that they're going to also have only one station during this construction period, or are they going to keep the Gladstone open, and why do they want to shut it down after that? Because it doesn't change its availability.
Right, but the answer to that question actually comes up in part of the coverage that we have on our news program, Local News Report, which you can watch of this same date. And we have film footage from the joint HEDC and City Council meeting that was held in January, that they talk about the fact that Maplewood has property along the rush line, not only on the west side of the rush line, meaning the Moose Lodge, but also right directly across on the other side, on the east side of the rush line, which means the fire station. So it appears that Maplewood is anticipating that they're going to possibly sell that property as part of an assemblage, that they think that they're going to have some big housing project over there, because during that same meeting, City Planner Michael Martin, he indicates and states that housing will be the predominant development in the Gladstone area, and that they must have they must continue with leading with housing in order to get any kind of commercial development in that area. So if you want to hear more about that discussion, as I said, please tune in to our local news report, where we will be covering that film footage and that discussion, which, while it was a public meeting, it was not videotaped or cable cast to the residents of Maplewood, and the only film footage available on it is from our archives and from our video. So, Mr. Bradley, your question about what are they going to do with that fire station? Well, I suspect they're going to sell the Gladstone Fire Station and try to sell it to a developer like Sherman and Associates, so that they can put more high-density housing in Gladstone.
Shouldn't you be, though, expecting that they would be having somebody actually having an offer on the table for how much it's going to be bought for? Because we put over, I think, almost $2 million in construction and all the other things that have been put in since then.
And as you made a point, a few shows ago, that it was only within the last few years that they put an entirely new roof on that building.
Right. So what is the price that would guarantee that we have to now abandon that station there? And at the same time, we're looking at that during this, even if we feel we needed 3 stations, which they're saying they don't need, why rebuild Hazelwood if we've got a station that is comparable or really there? The only thing they said was storage space, and that could be reimagined where they don't have that meeting room that I actually have been in many times.
Right, right. Well, you see, and there's always this issue that would come up, whether or not, if you're saying that your sole station north of Larpenteur is going to either be the Gladstone station or going to be the Hazelwood station, because between those two stations, you have a natural barrier, which is Highway 36. Right. And so it's not an easy thing just to be able to go north and south. There's only certain ways that you can do that. And of course, then that limits the amount of speed that your vehicle is going to have, whether it's an ambulance or a fire truck. And that would certainly support the claim that you would want to have a fire station both north of Highway 36 and south of Highway 36 to serve that portion of Maplewood that is north of Larpenteur, because that's a lot of space and municipal city north of Larpenteur. And the fire station over by 3M, that serves pretty much everything south of Larpenteur down to Carver, which borders on Newport. That's a long distance as well, but that's basically the area that that fire station serves.
The only thing that I can see that really verifies their statements is their own ineptitude, because they reduce the width of the streets that used to be there in Frost and, what is it, English?
Yes, right.
And the fact is that those were wide streets that any vehicle could get around, but now that they've made them what they call living streets or something like that, basically I consider them death streets right now, because of when a vehicle is in the way, you cannot get past it anymore. So the fact is that they made it harder to do rapid response there, and that was part of our city council being so myopic, or even, I won't even say myopic, stupid, plain and simple, ignorant, stupid jerks, because if they went through and said, yes, we can narrow these streets because there is no real purpose. Well, if you had kept Frost a wide street, you could go up to White Bear Avenue and could reach any place there on that part of it. Wouldn't have any problems with the highway. Mm-hmm. If you had kept English with its width, you can get on the highway, come off the entrance and exit ramps very easily, so you can have rapid response. But the rapid response has actually been minimized by a bunch of ignorant, stupid jerks that have been elected to Maplewood. And we really got to get rid of the jerks.
Well, hopefully...
Sorry, my opinion.
Well, and the voters in Maplewood, come the fall of 2020, will have that opportunity because of the 5 seats on the council, including the mayor, because there's 4 council members and 1 mayor, that 4 of those seats, 4 of the 5, are up for election. So that means the 2 city council members that were appointed, they're up for election should they choose to run. The appointed mayor, Marley Abrams, should she choose to run, she's up for election. And then, of course, we have Brian Smith, who was elected 5 years ago. He is up for re-election, and you're wondering, he's up 5 years after he was elected? How did that work? Well, he, of course, is one of the council members that voted to extend their term an extra year so that they could have even year elections and have the municipal elections lost in the national elections, so only those people that they really target are going to know that there's an election going on. Because, you know, we realize that when you have a national election, everybody is focused on the election of the president. That's what the whole focus is going to be on. The focus is not going to be on who should be the mayor of Maplewood. That's not what the fight's going to be about. So that will be lost in the hubbub of the presidential election. And personally, I believe that that's the reason why they wanted to change the elections to run with the presidential elections. Right. Is for that reason. They say because they want more people to get out to vote during that election, except that that's, sure, there will be more people out voting, but they're not out voting for mayor. They're out voting for president.
You've got to realize, Diane, there's going to be more people uninformed that are going to be out, because there's a lot more presidential money out there. And that means that a lot of the literature that's going to be created is going to be created by the National Party that's going to say vote any stupid decision we have come up with, like the Rapid Transit Commission's doing, or any of these other programs, like let's get rid of a brand new fire station and replace it with another fire station.
Now, getting back to this article, it's fascinating how I see that appointed Mayor Marley Abrams is inserting herself into this process. Keep in mind, Maplewood is what's called a Plan B city, which means that the mayor is the same standing as the council members. The mayor has no authority over and above what the council members have. The mayor doesn't run the city. The mayor is not a strong mayor. The city of Maplewood is run by a city manager. A city manager who runs the day-to-day affairs and who is basically the CEO of City Hall. St. Paul, on the other hand, is a charter city and has a strong mayor, meaning that the mayor actually does have a hand in running the city. So you see there's two different governmental structures going on. And yet here we have, in here where it says, Maplewood leaders are holding out hope the agreement can be salvaged. Mayor Marley Abrams said she spoke with St. Paul Mayor Melvin Carter and Council President Amy Bremon and asked that leaders from participating cities meet before they undo the agreement. Here she is inserting herself. Under Maplewood policy, in order for the mayor to do this type of action, it has to be approved by the city council that she had the authority to speak on behalf of the council to talk about these things. In reality, the person who should be on the phone is the city manager, Melinda Coleman, who is the one at City Hall who has the authority to negotiate for the city. The mayor of Maplewood does not have authority to negotiate on behalf of the city unless the council has given her that authority. We have not seen at any of the council meetings that the city council gave her that authority. So she is actually just winging it, and whatever she says while she says what she says actually has no power behind it whatsoever. And it's unfortunate that Maplewood city manager, Melinda Coleman, is not in this article saying that she got on the phone and that she's been talking to St. Paul City Hall, because that's who has the power to run the day-to-day affairs in Maplewood.
But you got to realize that Melinda Coleman is probably as, how should I say, goofy as our mayor, because of the city council. This is a small city, first of all, and that city council decided that they could not get things done unless they got a second city manager, an assistant city manager, because they can't have two equals. So Melinda Coleman has an individual who's helping her find her way, and she's been doing this for the longest period of time. She should not have to have an assistant. That's a lot of extra money, unless they're doing something behind closed doors, like playing cards. I don't know what they're doing, but why do you need an assistant in this small of an area? I don't know. I think he's a he and she's a she, so we can have all kinds of imaginative ideas, but that's all I know as fact is that they do have to have two people to run the city because it's so massive compared to Minneapolis or St. Paul.
Right. Well, let's take a look at some of that film footage that we took out of our archives from September 2019, when the city administration rolled out their big plan to decrease the number of fire stations in Maplewood, and they addressed the issue of response times. So let's get started with our first clip, where we have Fire Chief Lucan come up to bat to give some of the history of the department.
In the beginning of 2010, we started a strategic plan process to look at ways to staff our station using our current paid-on-call firefighters. In the beginning of 2011, we shared our strategic plan with the council and provided them with the following findings. Our findings showed that going to a part-time staffing model, having the paid-on-call firefighters sign up for shift and staff 3 stations around the clock would provide a greater number of firefighters on duty at at any given time. We no longer had to find a firefighter that lived within the area of a particular fire station. We could take firefighters from any community, we could take all the paid per call firefighters we have, and they could work at any one of our 3 fire stations that we were going to have at the time, which in turn provided us way better coverage than we currently have.
So he acknowledges that in 2010, when they had decreased the number of fire stations from 5 to 3, that the model that they were working with, where they had a combination department of full-time employed firefighter paramedics together with the part-time firefighter EMS personnel, that was working to provide that service to all of Maplewood. And, you know, if Maplewood were a small community, the shape of a box, basically, like,
Right.
say, for instance, North St. Paul, we might not have such a complicated discussion when it comes to coverage for EMS services. And I want to focus mostly on EMS services because of the calls for service to the Maplewood Fire Department. 80 to 83% of all of those calls are actually for EMS, for emergency medical services, not for fires. So that's really the bulk of everything that Maplewood does, is respond to medical calls. And so those are very much time critical. If you are, whether you're at a call 6 minutes or you're at a call 15 minutes, can be the matter of life and death. So back in 2010, what they had was working. Let's take a look as he continues, though, with that history.
That in turn led us to where the stations needed to be. So after we took a good look, you have to remember some of the stations were built back in the early 80s. Actually, one of the stations, the Gladstone station down there, was built back in the 40s. And we had the Hazelwood station that was built back in the early 70s. So when those stations were built, in the East County Line station down on London Lane, when they were built around where the population was and where the people we could get who were paid per call or volunteers could make it to the station in a reasonable amount of time. So at that point then, we really took a good look and we made the determination that based on moving some stations and closing others, we could provide the same coverage and pretty much provide the exact same response time, if not better, by going down to 3 stations. We had many hours of community engagement. We had meetings at those stations we were going to close, and ultimately it came down to is that we decided to close the London Lane station and we decided to close the Parkside station. The Parkside station would be covered by Station 3, which is in Hazelwood, and the Gladstone station, and the other one was to do as we did, and we were so grateful to the council at that time for that, was to move the East County Line station that was on was on Century Avenue to where it presently is today.
He goes through the history of the fire department, that originally Maplewood started with fire stations, and 5 of them, 5 fire stations.
Right.
And he talks, though, about the Gladstone station as if it was built in the 1940s. Well, the original Gladstone fire station was, but certainly at the point in time he's talking about, that they were looking at their 5 fire stations and deciding which ones to keep open and which ones to close, then that Gladstone fire station actually was only built 20 years ago. So you see, he's kind of leading people to believe that one of the fire stations in this mix was constructed in the 1940s, when that's not accurate. The Gladstone station was only built like 20 years ago, and that is one of the stations that remains open. And so he talks about the fact that they had all this engagement and talked about how they were going, they went through this process to close fire stations, and yet, that's not entirely accurate. Sure, they had a few open houses, but years ago, we provided the film footage that showed where at one of those open houses, a resident asked the then mayor, Will Rossbach, whether or not that the station was going to be closed, and he looked straight at that resident and straight into the camera and says, we are not closing any fire stations. And that's what they said back in 2010. Then 6 months later, they closed fire stations.
Well-
And so here we are back in 2019, where Fire Chief Lucan is trying to rewrite history, and that's not really quite the way it went down in the closure of 2 of the 5 fire stations back in 2010. So now let's take a look at our next clip.
It has lived up to the expectations of us having 3 stations. Well, our call volume increased, our business has gotten busier, the types of calls have gotten different over the years and we are now having, and we did earlier, have really trouble still getting part-time firefighters. Not only was it hard to get them and retain them again, but also other cities were starting to take our model of going to the part-time basis. So now they were stealing from us, we were stealing from them, and you can only use a firefighter so many hours in a day, no matter where they're at. And so it became a pretty significant issue.
Now you notice how all the firefighters and the EMS personnel in the back behind him, that they were all kind of like looking at each other when he started to talk about some of that stuff. Well, they were probably thinking to themselves, well, it's kind of hard to keep your part-time firefighters if you basically treat them like dirt and you're only paying them about $15 an hour. Well, I wonder why they had trouble keeping their part-time firefighters. And then, Mr. Bradley, do you recall, in the end, Maplewood decided to fire all of them. And as a result of them firing all their part-time firefighters, then the part-time firefighters, because then Maplewood was trying to raid their retirement fund, they sued the city of Maplewood. Well, the city of Maplewood couldn't resolve the issue in court because they probably would have not had the result they wanted. So instead, the city of Maplewood, they went to the legislature to have the legislature work out a solution that would supersede whatever happened in the court system. And of course, thanks to our representatives in the legislature, Peter Fisher and I believe Chuck Weger, that as a result of their actions at the legislature, well, you know, those firefighters, they had to give up part of their retirement fund and account back to the city of Maplewood. Well, thank you, Peter Fisher and Chuck Weger. So, Mr. Bradley, do you think that Fire Chief Lucan here is bringing any of those issues up?
No, in fact, the most important one is the volunteer part of it, where what we have as our city rule is that right now any employee can live any place they want throughout, unlike a lot of other cities. They require them to live within the confines of the city. And that way they can be easily accessed to go to something like this. So you can't expect rapid response if you don't do that. But our volunteer group was our rapid response if we didn't have a fireman there. But we got rid of them all. So what we have now is a bunch of firemen, and even when we have them there, if they're on vacation or if they happen to live in Long Lake, it's going to take a while for them to get in for it unless it's their shift.
Right, right.
So we really have not the same coverage we had even 5 years, 10 years, or 15 years ago. And yet we're reducing the amount of stations and the amount of accessible individuals to even respond to any type of emergency call. Mm-hmm. And that brings me to the question of what makes good city policy here. It seems like the policy is to see how many dollars can be squeezed out of the city to funnel it someplace else. And I know there's a lot of little projects that they've been doing.
Yeah, and keep in mind, Maplewood, again, going to your issue you brought up before, about having a city manager and an assistant city manager. Well, our fire department, paramedic department, we have a fire chief, we have a paramedic chief, we have a public safety department head who's over all of that. So it's actually 3 people who are involved with creating the policy for our public safety in the area of fire and EMS.
And I don't think any of those are receiving an hourly wage.
No, they're salaried all at $100,000 or more, which includes the benefits. So let's take a look at our next clip.
So in 2016, the Fire and EMS Work Group was commissioned, was put together. Countless hours, great people sat on that committee, and one of their recommendations that they came forth after meetings for so long was to commission the Fitch Group to look at staffing and changes that we needed to look at as we move forward into the thing. At that point then, I'll turn that over to Mike, and then after we're through here, any questions you have, we'd be very happy to answer. Thank you.
He talks about the commissioning of the Fitch Group. Well, the City Hall already had the foregone conclusion about what they wanted to do. And certainly, yes, this Fitch Group came in and they gave recommendations and findings consistent with what City Hall administrators wanted to do. Now, he references the fact that there was this little committee that was formed who looked at the issues. Well, it just so happens that one of the members of that committee is now appointed council member Bill Knudsen. In all of these discussions, did they talk about the response times? And the response times that they had under the old model, the response times that they had if they were only to have Maplewood respond, the response times if you include the mutual aid provided by neighboring communities such as Roseville, Little Canada, St. Paul to Maplewood. And in our next clip, we're going to hear more about that committee. Let's take a look.
Thank you, Chief Lucan. So I'm going to quick go over a background of how we got to today. As Chief Lucan alluded to, in 2016, the council authorized staff to form the Fire EMS Work Group to study service delivery as our models were changing and the demands were changing, and the investment was going to be substantial if we're going to continue to deliver the services that our community has come to expect. That Fire EMS Work Group included 5 citizen representatives, labor and management from public safety, the previous assistant city manager, and was facilitated by a third party. That group established core principles that they desired in the delivery of Fire EMS services, which include the desire to ensure excellence in service delivery, the need to provide responsible stewardship of public resources, and that the standard of fairness be applied to those delivering and receiving fire.
So I didn't hear any of the standards to include what does the response time have to be? What goal are we shooting for? Now, one thing I want to mention from the get-go, he does state accurately how this committee was formed, that the council authorized staff to establish a committee. And you see, why is that important? This committee did its work out of the public eye. Their meetings were not public. They were not required to uphold the open meeting law. Their meetings were not noticed to the public. They were not cable cast. They were not recorded. And certainly, we were not privy to when they occurred, so our cameras were not there. And the reason that this committee could operate in the back room like this is because the members were not appointed by the city council. Now, if the members of this committee had been appointed by the Maplewood City Council, then this committee would have been subject to the open meeting laws.
I got a question. I heard him say that there was one other person there, but he never really mentioned this third party, as he referred to it. Why wouldn't you state that? Because I think that is the most critical question there, is if it isn't part of the original situated, designated individuals, who was leading this? Because this was the most important individual, and we have just this obtuse statement of a third party.
Right, exactly. Who is that third party? But when you have your meetings in the back room behind locked doors, the public doesn't ever really know the answers to these questions.
Feels like the Wizard of Oz.
Well, let's continue with our next clip as he talks about, finally, response times.
In January, on January 25th of 2018, Fitch presented their findings to council. There were several recommendations. One of those, which we considered this kind of phase 1 and 1A, well, the primary one was to transition to a full-time staffing model, which we have done. The other big one of several recommendations was to consider realigning the fire station locations or consolidating operations from a 3-station model to a 2-station model. And that report was attached in your packet just for historical reference purposes. Fitch found in their study that the fire department's current performance was 8.3 minutes travel time, so from the time our staff goes en route to on scene for 90% of the incidents.
He said 90% of the incidents.
Right.
The statistics now that are being cited in the newspapers and in Maplewood public comments to the public is that it's at least 80%. So at that point in time, prior to the change in the model, it was 90% of the time that they had that response time of 8 minutes.
Right.
Now it is response time 8 minutes for 80% of the calls. So you see that the amount has gone down as to how many calls can they respond to in that 8 minutes. That could be a troubling issue, especially if you're the person having the heart attack and that you might have been in the 90% before, but now you are not in the 80% because there's a 10% difference there. Well, let's continue and look at our last clip today.
Since transitioning to a full-time staffing model, our response times have remained relatively consistent with our performance in 2016-17, despite an increased call volume, and I think that just speaks to some of the investment that you all have made in our staffing model. Call volumes continue to increase. Fitch at the time projected 5 to 6% per year. In 2017, we saw a 10% increase. In 2018, it went down to 4%. Year to date, we're at 8%. Most of that response is driven by EMS calls. 85% at the time of the study. Over the past 3 years, it fluctuates anywhere from 78 to 88%.
The statistics that I cited earlier are the statistics that I know from when I was mayor, which of course is confirmed by exactly the statistics that he gave in that clip as to the percentage of calls to our fire department for service, how many of them are for EMS. Now, Mr. Bradley, we've come to the end of our program. This is certainly going to be an issue that we're going to continue to watch as it pertains to the coverage of emergency medical calls in Maplewood and whether or not the city of St. Paul makes good on their word to exit the joint powers agreement or that mutual aid agreement with their neighboring suburban communities for providing mutual aid for emergency medical care such as heart attacks or for response to fires. So thank you, Mr. Bradley, for being here.
Thank you for having me.
And viewers, thank you for tuning in as well. We'll see you again next week. Bye-bye.